you have had it for long enough that it has become part of how you think about yourself. Friedrich Nietzsche had a specific name for the psychological structure underneath it. Not self-improvement, not aspiration, self-contempt dressed as discipline. You have been improving yourself for long enough to know it is not working, not because you have failed at the project, because the project has a structure that prevents completion. The standard rises as the person rises. The inadequacy relocates. The list is never finished. Nietzsche's observation was not that people should stop trying to change. It was that the specific form of trying most people call self-improvement is not the will to become something. It is the will to escape what you already are. And those are not the same project. That the person who wants to improve has identified a gap between what they are and what they should be, and that closing that gap through consistent effort is a straightforwardly good thing. Nietzsche's framework says this assumption conceals the most important question. Not whether the gap can be closed, where the gap came from. He distinguished between two fundamentally different orientations toward the self. The first he called self-overcoming, the will to become something that exceeds the current self, through genuine encounter with what that current self actually is. Not the performance of better, the transformation that requires first looking at what is actually there. The second, the one he spent the most time examining, he called slave morality, the orientation toward the self that begins not in expansion but in negation, in the decision that the current self is inadequate, that it requires management, that the gap between what it is and what it should be is the defining fact of its existence. The person in the grip of slave morality does not improve because they are becoming something. They improve because they cannot tolerate what they are. And the specific difference between becoming and escaping is the difference Nietzsche considered the most important one available, because one of them has a destination, and one of them is a permanent condition dressed as a temporary one. I will be better when I've done the work. I am not enough yet. The project is the evidence that I take myself seriously. The day I stop improving is the day I've given up. Nietzsche's question is not whether you take yourself seriously. It is whether the project is moving towards something, or moving away from something that has never been examined. Nietzsche documented the structure of slave morality most precisely and on the genealogy of morality. His examination was historical, how entire moral systems came to be organized around the negation of the self. But the psychological mechanism he described is precisely the one that drives the contemporary self-improvement project. The person operating from slave morality does not begin with themselves and ask what they are capable of. They begin with an external standard, what the better person looks like, what the optimized self produces, what the person they should be would have accomplished by now. And they measure the distance between themselves and that standard. The standard is not chosen, it is absorbed. It arrives before the person has the capacity to question it. And it has one consistent property. It is always just out of reach. The slave morality is not a whip in someone else's hand. It is the standard the person has internalized so completely that they apply it to themselves continuously, without requiring anyone else to be present. This is Nietzsche's first observation about the self-improvement project. The standard that drives it was not freely chosen. It was installed. And it was installed specifically in the form that would be most difficult to examine, as the voice of the person's own standards, their own ambition, their own legitimate desire for more. The second pattern is the one that reveals the structural impossibility. Research on perfectionism and self-improvement behavior consistently finds the same asymmetry. The people who engage most consistently and most seriously with the self-improvement project who have the most developed systems, the most disciplined habits, the most sophisticated frameworks for personal development, report the lowest levels of satisfaction with themselves. Not because the project has failed, because the project requires a permanent inadequacy to operate. Remove the inadequacy and there is no project. The project sustains itself by sustaining the condition it claims to be solving. I have come a long way. I am not where I was, but I am also not where I need to be. The work is not done. It will never be done. That is what it means to take the work seriously. Nietzsche's framework says the work will never be done because the work is not designed to be done. It is designed to be maintained. And what it maintains is the relationship between the person and their own inadequacy. The third pattern is the one with no remaining distance. Think about the specific area where your self-improvement project is most active, the area you return to most consistently, where the standard is clearest and the gap between yourself and the standard is most legible, and ask one question about it. What would you lose if that gap closed? Not what would I gain? What would I lose? What does the gap provide? What does the ongoing inadequacy give me that the arrival would not? The answer to that question is not comfortable, but it is the only question Nietzsche considered worth asking about the project, because the person who cannot answer it is not improving toward something. They are managing something that has no interest in being resolved. My child, think about the self-improvement project you've been running the longest, not the most recent one, the original one. The area of yourself that you identified as requiring work before you had the vocabulary for what you were doing, before the frameworks and the systems and the language of personal development, when it was simply the knowledge that something about you was not acceptable, and the decision made at some point that is difficult to locate precisely, that the appropriate response to that knowledge was to work on it. Now apply Nietzsche's question to that original project. Where did the standard come from? Not the current version of the standard. The first version, the one that told you what adequate looked like before you had chosen what adequate meant. I absorbed it from a parent, from a comparison, from a specific moment when the gap between what I was and what was expected became legible in a way it had not been before. I did not choose the standard. I accepted it. And I have been working toward it ever since. Nietzsche's framework asks the question that comes after that acknowledgement. What would you be without the project? Not what would you have failed to become? What would you be? If the inadequacy that drives the project were removed, if the gap simply closed, not through effort, but through the decision that the standard was not yours to begin with, what would remain? I don't know. The project has been there longer than the version of myself that existed before it. I am not sure who I am without it. I am not sure the person without it is someone I recognize. That uncertainty is not a failure of self-knowledge. It is the most honest answer available, and it is the answer Nietzsche considered the beginning of something real, not the self-improvement project, which has a known structure and a known impossibility, but the question of what the self actually is when the project is suspended. You have been improving yourself for long enough to know it is not working. Not because you lack discipline, not because the methods are wrong, because the project was never designed to work. It was designed to continue. He believed the answer was to examine what the project is actually doing, to look at the structure beneath the aspiration, at the relationship between the person and their inadequacy that the project has been sustaining. His concept of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, is not the project of becoming better. It is the project of becoming honest about what is actually driving the becoming. The distinction he drew was precise. The person operating from slave morality improves in response to an internalized standard they did not choose. The person capable of self-overcoming encounters the self that exists before the standard was applied, looks at what is actually there without the framework that divides it into adequate and inadequate, and asks what that self is actually capable of, not what it should be, what it is. Nietzsche's self-overcoming is not a gentler version of the self-improvement project. It requires something the improvement project specifically avoids: the encounter with the self as it is prior to the application of the standard. The improvement project cannot do this because it requires the standard to operate. Self-overcoming suspends the standard, temporarily, uncomfortably, without the reassurance that the suspension will produce something better, and looks at what is actually present. What is present is not inadequate. It is simply what is there. The project of becoming something begins from that encounter, not from the knowledge of what you should be. This is not comfort. Nietzsche never offered comfort. It is the only honest account of why the project never finishes, and of what would be required to begin something that could. The self-improvement project sustains itself through the maintenance of inadequacy. The only exit from it is not more improvement. It is the question the project was specifically designed to prevent you from asking, not what do I need to become? What am I before the standard arrived? And what is that self capable of, without the project telling it what it lacks? But the self-improvement project is not the only place where Nietzsche identified the will turning against itself. There is a more specific version. The good intention. The person who acts from care, from principle, from the sincere desire to do what is right, and produces, through the specific quality of that sincerity, something that functions more like weakness than strength, not because the intention is false, because the intention is operating from the same structure as the improvement project. The negation of the self dressed as the expression of it. Why your good intentions make you weak, that is next.